And he was thrown out of the kingdom because that was anti-psychodynamic, anti-Freudian, anti-everything at the time. We began to enlarge that with Heinz Kohut in self-psychology, who talked about therapy is basic and empathic, or empathy is a vicarious intervention. You all know about object relations theory, attachment, and relational psychoanalysis. So, Helen's going to pick up.
Almost no one in the Imago community knows that before I met Harville, I had a longing to be a Jungian analyst. And I had, as you all do know, I was getting my master's in counseling psych and went halfway through a PhD in clinical before we married. But I will mention just a couple theorists that I was so drawn to, which will indicate maybe for you all why I ended up proposing to Harville, because Harville was saying so much of this. But Carl Jung, just to point out that his view, you know, amid Freudian individualism and this background that Harville's just said, he said, you know, when little individuals are born, he called them little selves, people think there's a tabula rasa. That had been the philosophy at the time, a clean slate on which life then begins to shape. He said, I don't think so. I think that they're really little encodings of the soul when people are born, and that there are these archetypal pulls, and according to how you're born, you're pulled to become this way or pulled to become that way. And he was really fascinated at studying that everyone has their own archetypal nature, and a field called archetypal psychology grew out of that. But also, he said, you know, you're also getting dreams from your unconscious. Now, where does that come from? And he said, you've got to be in relationship with these dreams that you have. And so Jungian analysis is largely dream theory. And it makes me think of Netta Fetterman, who talks about, I mean, she has some beautiful theory she's cooking about really being in relationship with all of who you are toward being in relationship with those around you, and that synergy, that flow between the inner and outer. Well, Jung also challenged Freud's thing of, okay, my mentor, Freud, talks about the unconscious, but it's an individual unconscious. I think there's a collective unconscious. Just exciting little glimmers of that relational paradigm that we're all, underneath the individual unconscious is this sea of something that we're all in relationship to that helps. It keeps coming up and erupting into our lives. Carl Rogers is someone I had appreciated so much, the empathy-based therapy. The first person who said, you know, empathy is so important to healing. People went, what? And they said, well, really, if a therapist will be empathic and have unconditional positive regard to the client, I think that relationship is more healing than their insights. So, again, unconditional positive regard reminds me of Al Tuttle, pre-validation. Who invented pre-validation in the community?
Al Tuttle.
Okay. Turtle. Okay. Thank you for the correction. Anyway.
Oh, he's a turtle? I don't think so.
So, of course, then Kharkov came along and started studying empathy and doing research on empathy. But there are two quotes of Rogers. He said, when I look at the world, I'm pessimistic. But when I look at people, I'm optimistic. And I think that came from what so many of you experience in your therapy offices, how people will just open up like a rose when there's empathy in the room, because empathy is relational. Another quote of his, what is most personal is what is most universal. And who does that remind us of? So you can see why, you know, I just began to swoon when I would hear Harville talk. I was his first groupie. So I was early on. I'm proud of being number 2. So women's relational psychoanalysis, I'll say more about that, but we know Carol Gilligan Kohlberg had said, people are born attached to their mothers, and so the goal in therapy is to separate and individuate and be your proud, wonderful self. And women have come along at the same time that Getting was being written, absolutely parallel to that. Women were saying, I'm not so sure. Maybe the telos of life is relationship, attachment, a healthy attachment, that maybe our strength comes from healthy relationships. So that was a glimmer of the relational paradigm, and then interpersonal neurobiology. I just would mention that that neuroplasticity stuff is, of course, so exciting, that Freud had said anatomy is destiny. Whatever you're born with, you're stuck with. Freud also said, near the end of his life, he said, now, what's the goal of all this psychoanalysis? And he said, well, the goal of psychoanalysis is to resign yourself to human misery. And when we learned that the brain can evolve, and neuroplasticity, then people like Dan came up. The brain is experience dependent. We have social brains. And he has moved beyond the single skull theory of the brain, and even sounds like Mary Rita. He says, I think we can like move beyond the I and me toward the me. He says it sort of
to the
we. Move between the you and I toward the we. So psychoanalysis, psychotherapies are really moving toward that relational paradigm. But philosophy, Martin Buber, the I and the thou, that it's when we learn to move beyond treating each other like objects and I, it. And if we can ever get to the point that we treat our partner and others as an I, thou, that some universal flow of love comes between these two people and something holy begins to reside in the space between. So philosophy, too, is saying that something ineffable happens when two people come together in empathy, regard, and that's the space between is sacred space. So relational in ethics, it was two women who were partners, Bev Harrison, Carter Hayward. And this was, again, right as Getting was being written. The roots of our desire to act for justice grows out of our longing for right relations. Judy Jordan, Jean Baker Miller, it's essential we learn to maintain our strengths through connection by validating, valuing, and sustaining relational context. Judy Jordan. By the way, Judy Jordan is on the board of an organization that Harville and I will tell you about, that he had the idea of starting. And then the relational has moved out into the culture. And the real point of this slide is things can change. I mean, y'all are all here because you're such hopeful people. You know that. Some people don't know that. Things can change. Civil rights movement, we've all lived to see change happen. The women's movement. And women moved into relationship with themselves and with each other. And their goal with Bev Harrison and Carter Hayward, languaging it, was to create right relationship with men. So just to mention, this is really it's even beyond the culture. There's this pulsing out, pulsing in, the masculine energy, feminine energy, focus, mosaic. Both are important. Rational, intuitive, action, reflection, they're both important. That whole feminine energy, however, was suppressed in the patriarchy. The yang and the yin. You know, this is like just global, and it's in all cultures. There are these pulls, and they should be equally related. They should be in right relationship. Gloria Steinem in the 80s was so upset. She said, our masculine culture is patriarchal, thus our marriage structure is patriarchal, thus marriage is a dangerous place for women. Don't do it. Don't even think about it. It's dangerous. It is costly to your sense of self. Well, Imago rose up, and over time, and maybe that women's movement too, there has been more of a shift from Father Knows Best, the top down, to that horizontal shared idea in a marriage. To the degree that Patty Howell, a woman that we met about 5 years ago, headed up a federally funded research project throughout the state of California. She worked for 4 years on it. Seismic shift, the results of her study 30 years later. Healthy marriages produce healthy women and girls. Yay, everybody get married. And do Imago, because that needs to be added to the feminist agenda. Healthy marriages will empower women and empower men. Oh, by the way, Andrea Cam yesterday, she said, by the way, that patriarchy thing, we talk about women being oppressed, it was men, too, equally oppressed. And so that was bad for everybody. I see a lot of heads nodding. Glad you get it. So whereas marriage was once a dangerous place for women, it doesn't have to be anymore. So we believe that as we're moving from the age of the individual to the relational age, Imago will help ensure we're teaching people to allow every voice being heard and every opinion. Let's try to get more in the habit of pre-validating each other. Thank you, Al. Every revolution needs tools to create the structure that will hold the revolution. And Harville and I